You can't hide it anymore, Sophie, his voice echoed in the dim light, breaking the fragile silence of the night. I froze, turning to see Jack, my stepfather. He stood at the doorway of my room, leaning against the frame, his shirt slightly unbuttoned and revealing just enough to make my pulse quicken. He was 59, but the confidence in his eyes and the way he looked at me made everything around me blur. I wasn't ready for this. Dressed in nothing but a thin silk nightgown, I felt exposed under his gaze. His eyes slowly traveled, lingering on my legs, moving to my hips, then meeting my face. My cheeks flushed instantly, and I knew there was no hiding it. "Jack, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, my voice betraying the panic rising inside me. But my trembling words seemed to invite him closer rather than push him away. He stepped into the room, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with a trace of whiskey surrounding me. The tension was suffocating, yet I couldn't move. His hand brushed against the door handle, and for a moment, it looked like he might close the door behind him. "I know what you're feeling," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "We can't keep pretending this isn't real." I backed up until I felt the edge of the bed pressing against me. My breath hitched as his fingers grazed my wrist, sending a jolt through my entire body. He leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming. "Jack, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the plea fell flat as his hand lightly traced the line of my neck. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Tell me to stop, Sophie," he murmured, his voice almost a challenge, "and I will walk away." But his eyes told a different story, one that demanded answers I wasn't sure I could give. My mind raced, torn between the impossibility of the situation and the undeniable gravity pulling us together. The tension shattered abruptly when a loud crash sounded from the next room. My head snapped toward the source, and Jack straightened instantly, his calm demeanor replaced with a sudden alertness. His gaze darted to the door, then back to me, holding my eyes for a fraction longer than necessary. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice steady, though the moment between us lingered heavily in the air. As he stepped out of the room, the warmth of his presence faded, but his final glance over his shoulder made my stomach twist. His look wasn't one of regret, it was a promise. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands gripping the sheets as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind was a mess, replaying every word, every glance, every touch. There was no denying it now, something had shifted. I wasn't sure if I should feel terrified or exhilarated. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. The crash from the other room might have interrupted us tonight, but it wouldn't be enough to stop whatever had started. Jack wasn't the type to let things go. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. I closed my eyes for a moment, but the silence of the room only amplified the whirlwind inside me. Every sound from the house made my heart race, every shadow felt like him returning, and every breath carried the weight of anticipation. A few days had passed since that night, and the air in the villa was growing heavier with unspoken tension. Jack had kept his distance, but every time we crossed paths, his eyes lingered a second too long, his presence impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself it was just in my head, but deep down, I knew better. One afternoon, the scorching sun made it unbearable to stay inside. Jack appeared at the doorway of the living room where I was pretending to read a magazine. His voice was casual, but his eyes betrayed a hint of something else. "How about a swim?" "The pool looks too good to waste," he suggested, holding up a glass of iced lemonade. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if being alone with him outside was a good idea. But refusing might seem suspicious, and besides, I needed to escape the suffocating silence of the house. "Sure," I said, setting the magazine aside and following him out to the patio. The sun was blazing, and the water sparkled invitingly. I settled on a lounge chair, wrapping my arms around myself more out of nerves than to shield from the heat. Jack disappeared briefly into the house and returned with 2 glasses of lemonade. His shirt was unbuttoned, revealing just enough of his chest to make me look away when he handed me a drink. "Thanks," I murmured, taking a sip to distract myself. He sat down on the lounge chair next to mine, his movements relaxed, but his gaze sharp as it locked onto mine. "You should be more careful with those looks, Sophie," he said, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable edge. I glanced up at him, feigning ignorance. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. My hands fidgeted with the straw in my glass, betraying my nerves. Jack leaned closer, the faint scent of his cologne drifting toward me. His voice dropped to a near whisper. You know exactly what I mean. The heat from the sun was nothing compared to the fire coursing through me. In a moment of defiance, or maybe an attempt to regain some control, I slipped off my cover-up, revealing my swimsuit. His reaction was immediate, his eyes darkening as they swept over me. The shift in his expression sent a shiver down my spine. "You're playing with fire, Sophie," he said, his voice both a warning and a challenge. "I think I can handle it," I shot back, surprising even myself with the boldness in my tone. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension between us was thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't tell if I wanted to run or let it consume me. Needing to break the moment, I stood and walked toward the pool. I could feel his gaze following me, burning into my back as I dove into the cool water. The brief reprieve from the intensity was a relief, but it didn't last. When I surfaced, Jack was standing at the pool's edge, his arms crossed as he watched me. "You're going to stay in there all day?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes anything but. I swam closer to the edge, debating whether to climb out or stay where I was. Before I could decide, he crouched down and extended a hand. "Here," he said, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. I hesitated but took his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch against my damp skin. As he pulled me up, his grip lingered just a fraction too long, his fingers brushing against mine even as I stepped onto the patio. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't move. "You're soaked," he said, his voice low, almost amused. But his eyes betrayed something far deeper. The moment passed as quickly as it came. I wrapped myself in a towel, avoiding his gaze as I sat back on the lounge chair. The rest of the afternoon passed in near silence, but the tension was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. As the sun began to set, I found myself glancing at Jack more than I should have. He seemed calm, almost unaffected, but there was a certain intensity in his demeanor that made me uneasy. It was as if he was waiting, for what, I didn't know. That evening, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Jack's lingering looks, his subtle touches, the way he seemed to be testing my boundaries, it all felt like a prelude to something inevitable. And deep down, I knew I wasn't ready for it. But I also knew one thing for certain, Jack wasn't going to stop. Not this time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, filling the villa with a deceptive calm. I had barely slept, haunted by the weight of what had happened at the pool. Today, I resolved to keep my distance. It was the only way to regain some semblance of control. I wandered through the villa aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the oversized, empty rooms. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed heavier. Eventually, I settled in the living room, picking up a book from the shelf more for distraction than genuine interest. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped the pages, the words blurring together. The tension in the air hadn't dissipated, it was just waiting, lingering. The quiet didn't last long. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Jack entered the room casually, but his presence filled the space immediately. He stopped in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame as he observed me. "Hiding from me?" he asked, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable undertone. I froze, my fingers tightening around the book. I didn't look up. "I'm just reading," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Really?" he asked, stepping closer. His tone was light, almost teasing, but there was something unsettling beneath it. "Then why is your book upside down?" The words hit me like a slap. My chest tightened as I realized I had given myself away. Slowly, I lowered the book, but I still didn't meet his gaze. Jack moved to the couch and sat down beside me. Too close. The fabric dipped under his weight, and I could feel the warmth of his proximity. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine briefly. The touch was so light it could have been innocent, but it wasn't. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge that made my stomach churn. "You can pretend all you want, but you can't hide how you feel. Not from me." I stiffened, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my body refused to cooperate. I stood abruptly, hoping the motion would break the moment, but before I could take a step, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Not roughly, but firmly enough to stop me. "Don't run," he said. There was no anger in his voice, but the command was clear. I just need some air," I managed to say, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His grip loosened, and he let go. "Fine," he said, leaning back against the couch. "How about some air by the pool? It's a nice day, and you've been cooped up inside." I hesitated, but the alternative, staying alone with him in the confined space of the villa, seemed worse. Okay, I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. The walk to the pool felt endless. Jack followed me at a leisurely pace, his presence looming behind me like a shadow. The sun was already high, casting a harsh glare on the water. I kicked off my sandals and dipped my feet into the pool, trying to ignore the sound of him pulling a chair closer. "You've been tense lately," he said after a long silence. "Is it me?" I glanced at him, caught off guard by the directness of his question. "No, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a small smile. He chuckled softly. "You're a terrible liar, Sophie." I didn't respond, focusing instead on the ripples in the water as I moved my feet. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, charged. Finally, I stood and stepped into the pool. The cool water was a relief against my heated skin, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I swam to the far side, putting as much distance between us as possible. But even with the space, I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. When I turned to swim back, he was standing at the edge of the pool. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze was anything but. I hesitated before swimming closer, unsure of what to do. As I reached the edge, he extended his hand, the same way he had before. I stared at it, my mind racing. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. I reached up, letting him pull me out of the water. His grip was firm, and when I stood, his hand lingered on mine longer than necessary. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away quickly, wrapping a towel around myself. "Thanks," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. The rest of the afternoon passed in near silence. Jack seemed content to sit by the pool, watching me from the corner of his eye. I tried to focus on anything else, the sound of the water, the feel of the sun on my skin, but it was impossible. His presence was suffocating, even when he wasn't speaking. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted. Not physically, but mentally. Every moment with him felt like walking a tightrope, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep my balance. That evening, the villa was eerily quiet. Jack had disappeared somewhere, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe. But the reprieve was short-lived. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tension began to creep back in. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: Jack wasn't done testing me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day began with an unsettling quiet. My mother left early, heading to a nearby town for the entire day, leaving me alone with Jack. The villa felt even larger, its silence amplifying every small sound. I couldn't shake the tension lingering in the air, a tension that had only grown since the previous days. Being alone with him was the very thing I feared, and yet, there was a part of me that couldn't deny the strange pull it had. I sat on the terrace, clutching my coffee mug tightly, hoping the cool morning breeze would calm my nerves. I stared out at the garden, trying to lose myself in the soft rustle of leaves. But my thoughts kept returning to him, and the inevitability of another interaction. The door behind me creaked, and I knew without looking who it was. "Morning," Jack said, his voice low and casual as he approached. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, setting one down in front of me before taking the chair beside mine. His movements were unhurried, almost deliberate, and his presence seemed to fill the entire space. "Thanks," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the garden, though I could feel his gaze on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, and I didn't dare look at him. Then, his voice cut through the stillness. "We've been playing this game for days, Sophie. How much longer are you planning to drag it out?" His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, almost a challenge. I finally turned to face him, my breath hitching slightly as our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze was unmistakable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I didn't know what to say, and I doubted anything I could say would change the way he was looking at me. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I think you already know the answer," he said, his voice softer now, almost teasing. I stood abruptly, needing to escape the weight of the moment. "I should go check on something," I said, my voice shaky as I stepped away from the terrace. Jack didn't stop me, but I felt his eyes on me as I walked back into the villa. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, he'd find a way to follow. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. I busied myself with small tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every sound made me jump, every shadow made me pause. The tension was suffocating, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it surfaced again. Later that afternoon, I retreated to my room, hoping for a brief moment of peace. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair slowly, trying to ground myself. But then I heard it, a soft knock on the door. Before I could respond, it opened, and Jack stepped inside. I froze, my hand gripping the brush tightly. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence filling the room. I could feel my pulse quicken, the air around us growing heavier. "Sophie," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "We both know this is more than a game." He took a step closer, and I felt my breath catch. His hand reached out, brushing against my shoulder before settling on my neck. His touch was warm, almost soothing, but the tension it carried was anything but. "Jack," I started, my voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't let me finish. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the conflict in them, the same conflict I felt inside myself. "I know you feel it too," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "Why are we pretending otherwise?" I wanted to step back, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't move. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt trapped between what I knew was right and what I couldn't deny was happening. The moment stretched, the silence between us growing louder with each passing second. Then, just as I felt the tension reach its breaking point, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered it. My mother had returned, earlier than expected. Jack stepped back instantly, his expression shifting to one of practiced neutrality. He didn't say another word as he turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my thoughts racing. The night wrapped the villa in an eerie silence. I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, my thoughts racing uncontrollably. I couldn't escape them, his voice, his hands, the way he looked at me. It was as though the tension between us was a storm brewing, ready to explode at any moment. Sleep was impossible. Then, I heard it, soft, steady footsteps in the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned my head toward the door, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound grew louder. Closer. I held my breath as the handle turned, and the door opened without a knock. Jack stepped inside, his movements calm, deliberate, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. His shirt was undone, revealing the faint lines of his chest, and his expression was unreadable, serious, intense. He closed the door behind him, his gaze locking onto mine. "I knew you weren't sleeping," he said, his voice low and deliberate. He took a few steps closer, stopping at the edge of the bed. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" I froze, unable to respond. My breath quickened as he moved even closer, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. He sat on the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. My body reacted instantly, a shiver running through me as his presence filled the space. "Jack, you shouldn't be here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But the words felt hollow, like I didn't mean them. "Shouldn't I?" he replied, his hand reaching out to brush lightly against my knee. His touch was warm, deliberate, and it sent a jolt through me. "You don't really want me to leave." I tried to pull away, but his hand tightened slightly, holding me in place. The way he looked at me, the way his fingers moved slowly along my leg, it was overwhelming. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. "This isn't just me, Sophie," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "You feel it too, don't you?" I swallowed hard, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was written all over my face. His other hand moved, brushing a strand of hair from my cheek. The intimacy of the gesture made my pulse quicken even more. "Say the word," he whispered, his breath warm against my face. "Tell me to stop, and I will." But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The silence between us was deafening, the tension unbearable. His hand moved to my waist, pulling me slightly closer. His fingers lingered there, tracing small, deliberate patterns on my skin. "See?" he murmured, his lips so close I could feel the heat of them. "You don't want me to stop." "Jack," I began, but my voice faltered. He leaned in closer, his forehead nearly touching mine. His hand slid further up my waist, settling just below my ribs, and I felt my breath hitch. "We've been dancing around this for days," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why fight it anymore?" His lips brushed against my cheek, the lightest of touches, but it sent a wave of heat through me. His hand moved higher, to the small of my back, pulling me closer until there was barely any space between us. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, as if it was in sync with mine. "Jack, this is—" I tried again, but his lips brushed against mine, silencing me. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but the tension in the air was enough to make my entire body tremble. "If it's wrong," he said, his voice low and intimate, "then why does it feel like this?" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even think. His lips finally met mine, softly at first, testing, but it quickly deepened. His hand moved to my neck, his fingers sliding into my hair as he pulled me closer. Every nerve in my body was on fire, every thought replaced by the intensity of the moment. His other hand moved down, settling on my thigh. His grip was firm, and it sent a shiver through me. I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping his shirt, as though I was afraid he'd pull away. The world around us disappeared, and all that mattered was him, his touch, his lips, the way he held me like I was the only thing that existed. Just as his hand moved further up my leg, the sound of something crashing in the hallway shattered the moment. It was loud, startling, and it pulled both of us back to reality. Jack froze, his head snapping toward the door. I sat there, breathless and trembling, trying to process what had just happened. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. Then, Jack pulled away, his hands dropping from me as he stood. His expression was a mix of frustration and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "This isn't over," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You know that, don't you?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, my body still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. He lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine, before turning and walking to the door. He paused there, his hand on the handle, and looked back at me. "This isn't the end, Sophie," he said softly, then stepped out, closing the door behind him. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding, my mind a chaotic mess. What had just happened felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and it was far from over.